I'm Terri Combs-Orme, Urban Child Institute endowed professor in the College of Social Work at the University of Tennessee. This course is provided to you at no charge by the College of Social Work at the University of Tennessee and the Urban Child Institute in Memphis, Tennessee. There are no restrictions on how you may use this material. If you have questions or want additional information, feel free to email me at the email address you will see at the bottom of this slide. So today we're going to be talking about stress and hormones as it influences not just our physical health but our mental health as well. This information obviously is so important to social workers because we see so many people who are under stress. But what is stress? Stress is not a feeling. Stress is not an event that happens to you. Stress is a physiological process for coping with challenge or threat. And it is the reason that our species has survived all these many millennia. And it has evolved to permit our survival in many environments. So let's talk about that physiological process. Here's how it works. The hypothalamus is a section of the brain responsible for hormone production, including those that govern body temperature, thirst, hunger, sleep, circadian rhythms, moods, sex drive, and the release of other hormones in the body. The hypothalamus also controls the pituitary gland, as you see in this picture, and is responsible for keeping the body in homeostasis. The hypothalamus releases a chemical telling your pituitary gland, hey, we're in trouble here, we need to do something. And it releases ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. I won't say that long word again, don't worry. This is a hormone produced by the backside of your pituitary gland that tells your adrenal cortex that it needs to get busy and do something. And what this does is stimulate the release of adrenaline into your body to prepare you for action. Now, adrenaline has a number of effects that we're mostly aware of after they're over. But it stimulates the body to be ready to run or to fight if necessary. So it mobilizes all of your energy. It increases your cardiovascular tone, increases your heartbeat to get more oxygen out to your muscles. And it suppresses the stuff that you don't actually need in the moment to survive. So you don't need to digest that hamburger you had for lunch. You don't need to grow. You don't need your immune system in this very short moment. You don't need your reproduction system. So it then sharpens the senses you do need to get out of there or fight. So your alertness, your focus on what is threatening you are all increased and sharpened in preparation for what's coming. Now, if you'll notice, cortisol is at the very bottom of this picture. And all the time we hear people talking about cortisol as the stress hormone. What cortisol actually is kind of the end of that system of stress response. It's responsible for getting your body back to normal. As you see on this illustration here, although adrenaline flows early, peaks, and then goes down fast, cortisol is a lagging kind of indicator of stress. It flows gradually and increases, and then it will decrease at the same slow pace. So it's interesting that you really don't feel the worst of some of the effects of this on your body until it's over. Now, if you are under a lot of stress all the time, so that adrenaline is flowing and cortisol is called upon to do its job repeatedly, what may happen is that things go wrong. But in the short term, stress is extremely adaptive. It enables you to survive a threat, and a very immediate threat, where you don't have time to think about the consequences and what you need to do. But it's designed to be shut down by that feedback loop. And the loop can be disrupted by chronic stress or extremely severe stress. The other thing that's very important to remember is that the body cannot tell the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. So we evolved to escape various kinds of stressful conditions. And here you see the real kind of stress we evolved to deal with. The bear chasing the man. The man perceives the bear as a big threat before he even stops to think about what it weighs or what its teeth can do to him. And so his bloodstream pours adrenaline, allowing him to run as fast as he can. Unfortunately, it won't be fast enough, but the body does the best it can. So this is the real kind of stress we evolved to deal with, and it's a very elegant physiological system that we have. Unfortunately, this is the kind of stress we mostly have these days. Fairly low level, at least compared to being chased by a bear, but constant and continuing in our minds long after the events have ended. The antelope on the savannah does not worry about the fact, after he gets really lucky and outruns the lion, he doesn't fret about it all the rest of the day. Well, I shouldn't have been out there. I should have been somewhere else. If I had just looked up earlier, yada yada. The antelope lets it go. However, when you have an unpleasant interaction with your boss or get stuck in traffic for hours, you may fret about it all day long. And those hormones will keep flowing even though the threat is past. This is not a healthy system, and it's not what we evolved to do. So you might ask, what happens? How do we have the resources to cope with stress? You may have read about a young mother moving a car off her toddler in a time of extreme emergency to save the child's life. Well, our body has ways of dealing with these kinds of events. Our system wants to be in homeostasis, meaning it's fairly narrow level of heartbeat, blood sugar, everything, and there's a healthy kind of middle range it always seeks. So allostasis is the process through which systems change to try to get back to homeostasis. So when you're hot, you sweat. When you're cold, you shiver. These are processes trying to bring your body temp back where it belongs. Doing that is useful. It enhances survival, but it does cost the organism something. There's kind of a rage on the internet now about how shivering when you're cold burns calories. So people are going around in cold rooms trying to lose weight. So that does burn calories. That may be the only cost of your allostasis. But it may be more serious than that if it goes on longer, if the stress is extreme and chronic. Those resources come from your body in some way. Now we call this your allostatic load. When we think about allostatic overload, we're basically talking about a situation where the stress is constant or severe enough that you reach the point where you don't really have the physiological resources to mount that constant effort to adapt. I think of a situation of war where you hear bombs exploding all around. You're constantly waiting maybe for troops to overrun your area. You're trying to protect your family. This will cause the adrenaline to continue to flow.
The body may become insensitive to the flow of cortisol and fail to shut down the stress response as intended. In other cases, the lack of response to cortisol may cause the body to simply quit producing it at all. This can be dangerous as we rely on cortisol to help us escape threatening situations.
So, all of those things we talked about earlier continue to happen. You still have a high heart rate. You have constantly high blood pressure. Even by a few points over many years, this will damage your body's organs. Your immune system is dialed down, even though you're still exposed to infections. The other thing is that when you're under a great stress, your brain is very, very focused on just getting out of there. And the hippocampus in your brain, which is the focus of learning and memory, is not able to function effectively for higher order thinking. It's focused on emergency thinking. It will result in reproductive dysfunction. Women's menstrual periods may stop when they're under extreme stress. And in addition, digestive problems. You know how you may get an upset stomach when you're extremely nervous, say before your wedding? If that continues, if that kind of anxiety continues, you may develop chronic digestive problems such as irritable bowel disease or constipation. So these are common things in our society right now that result from chronic unremitting stress. So, what do we see in populations and individuals who are under chronic stress? First of all, we see poor birth outcomes. We'll talk about this more in the subsequent lesson. We see children having problems learning and achieving poorly in school. Children's brains need to be able to be calm enough to absorb new information. And the hippocampus is not in any condition to learn when the hormones are poor in this way. This, incidentally, is why you can't remember anything you stayed up all night trying to study. The stress just blocks you from learning it altogether. We see mental health disorders increased, and you can see that in war-torn populations. You can see that in people who experienced Hurricane Katrina. These experiences don't go away after the event sometimes, and people who experience those kinds of continuing traumas can really have serious organ damage. Heart disease is more common among survivors of trauma, and part of this is because of that rapid heartbeat, the high blood pressure, the things that in the short run will save your life but are not designed to be chronic. Infections are more common among people who are highly stressed because their immune system is dialed down. And finally, the real scourges of our time, obesity and diabetes, are tied to chronic stress in that they disrupt the metabolic system, which is not designed to deliver extreme amounts of energy all the time. So these are very serious problems. We see them in individuals, but we also see them in populations. So how does this happen? I want to spend just a few moments talking to you about how stress is related to social experiences and how these can influence development. So let's start by talking about maternal care. One of the things that we've learned is that good parenting enhances achievement throughout life, enhances relationships, all kinds of things. And we unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we cannot do experiments on human beings to see how they respond long-term to very poor parenting early in life. So Michael Meany's lab at McGill University has done some fascinating research using mice to demonstrate the long-term effects of poor parenting. You may wonder if this is relevant to human beings, and the fact is we share 97.5% of our genes with mice. They really are a lot like us. So one thing that Meany was interested in was parenting. So he looked at the mouse equivalent of nurturing and loving and stroking and hugging, particularly in the first few years of life. In mice, the equivalent to these behaviors for humans is licking and grooming the new pups and arching the back very high when they're nursing to make it easier and less stressful for them to get enough to eat. So in mice, good mothers lick and groom a lot and make it easy for their infants to nurse at a time when their stress response systems are developing. And we'll talk about this more fully later on when we discuss the lifespan. What's interesting is that although we may not think of it, there are good parents and bad parents in the animal kingdom as well. What you see here is pretty much a normal distribution that Meany's group produced after many, many months of observing mouse mothers and their pups. And we basically see that on the left end you've got abusive mothers, extremely neglectful mothers, and on the far right maybe you've got your mouse soccer moms, I don't know, but very attentive, loving, lots of nurturing. So Meany's group was interested in knowing what long-term effects this would have on the mice. Now, the fascinating findings, and we'll come back to this in just a few moments, is that the more nurturing parenting, as marked by the licking and grooming, resulted in healthier stress responses in the baby mice. Their brains were enhanced, they learned better, they learned more quickly. They were able to memorize mazes and get through them more easily. Their metabolisms were better. There was less diabetes. They were not obese. And interestingly, those female pups grew up to have much better rates of reproduction. What this group attributes all of this to is that very loving, nurturing parenting enhances the activity of endocrine systems to promote growth and suppress those that inhibit growth.
This slide shows the mechanism through which maternal licking and grooming enhance stress responses in their offspring. Increased nurturing, licking and grooming, leads to an increased number of glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus to take up stress hormones. This allowed the baby mice to recover more quickly from stress.
This is another illustration of it, showing a more modest response in the stress response system to stress by babies whose mothers licked and groomed them a lot. Now, it was early on realized that this might not be a perfect illustration of what happens to humans. Although we're very much like mice, there is a little bit of a difference in how quickly and when, over time, the brain reaches its various levels of development. So further research is now trying to replicate in some way this research with human beings. McGowan et al. In Quebec had an interesting opportunity to approach the kind of research we need. They got hippocampal tissue, remember that part of the brain that is important to learning and memory, from the Quebec Suicide Brain Bank, and were able to analyze the brains of 12 suicide victims who had been victims of child abuse, 12 suicide victims who were not, and 12 controls, people who died of other causes. And they really went out of their way to research these backgrounds. So they're pretty certain, for instance, that the individuals with no abuse really were never abused. These people were matched for psychiatric diagnosis, gender, and age, and so to make sure nothing else influenced these findings. And they looked at methylation. Remember, we discussed that back in the genetics unit, and the expression of genes related to those glucocorticoid receptors. Remember, we need lots of receptors to take up the stress hormones so that we recover faster from a stressful event. What they found was that suicide victims with a history of child abuse had many fewer glucocorticoid receptors in their brains. And there were no differences between the numbers of receptors between the non-abused suicide victims and the non-abused controls. Now, of course, this is not totally conclusive, but it does suggest that that part of the mechanism of child abuse, poor parenting, leading to reduced receptors is consistent with what they observed in the suicide victims. But I want to return to Meany's research and tell you one of the most exciting things, and the thing that as social workers we understand, since we see so much in daily practice of poor parenting. The female offspring of the good mothers, the high licking and grooming mothers, became the same kinds of mothers when they reproduced. And the pups who had been poorly parented also became poor parents. One little criticism that Meany's lab got at first was that, well, maybe you just inherit in your genes the kind of mother you had. So good mothers, nurturing mothers, have nurturing children just from genetic influences. In order to take a look at that, they actually performed a number of experiments by cross-fostering. So they took the babies of the mothers who were good mothers and put those with bad mothers and vice versa. And what is interesting and fascinating is that they found that almost all of the effect was based on the nurturing, not on the genes that the infant pups received. So this shows you how we think maternal care influences so many of the outcomes that it influences in life. Maternal care of different sorts results in different methylation of the genes responsible for forming those glucocorticoid receptors. Remember, we want more of those receptors. When those are produced effectively and we get more of those receptors, our systems are more responsive to the way the human stress response is supposed to operate. In other words, it's more sensitive to the feedback, performing the way it should. And we believe this is the origin of that connection between early parenting and later life outcomes, both physical and mental. So in the final set of slides presentation for this class, we'll try to pull all of this together and discuss specific ways that it is related to social work practice. Thank you.